In 2018, a rumor surfaced that Diablo 4 was originally intended to be a Dark Souls-like game. Dubbed Project Hades, the idea was obviously scrapped for the current version of the game under development, but I still couldn't help but wonder, what if this game was never cancelled? And there just so happens to be a game that recently came out that is somewhat Diablo-esque and is Souls-like. In fact, it comes from the same company that made Dark Souls, and that is the wildly popular game Elden Ring. Now, while there are fundamental differences between this game and what a Diablo game traditionally should be, I still think there's a ton to unpack and take away in terms of why Elden Ring has been so successful and just so fun. Both that can be applied to other open world fantasy games like the upcoming Diablo 4, as well as just in terms of game development, best practices in general, including from Blizzard Entertainment. So with that, what exactly makes Elden Ring so good and so successful? Well, first, before the game even came out, it actually generated quite a bit of hype, with big name George R.R. Martin from Game of Thrones being on board, as well as From Software's already quite stellar track record behind them. And what's impressive is that the game actually even exceeded and perhaps over-delivered on these already very high expectations. First of all, it definitely gave Dark Souls, Sekiro, and Bloodborne fans what they wanted in terms of the gameplay that they know and love, and perhaps even made adjustments to that gameplay, taking some of the best aspects from each of these aforementioned games. So not only does the game greatly reward you for practicing your combat gameplay, but it also doesn't really limit you to the playstyle that you can pick, with tons of different builds being actually very viable. And also, part of what makes the game so fun and immersive, in my opinion, is how it really doesn't try to hold your hand, which makes you feel somewhat respected and challenged, and also rewarded for learning the game and improving your gameplay and also progressing your character. Sure, it can be a bit difficult to figure out where to go for some of the especially side quests, and also perhaps some of the bosses, especially the early ones, can seem quite difficult, especially for people who haven't really played any of these Soulsborne games. But the game seems to be designed with the awareness that there are in fact guides that people can refer to online to accomplish all of these things, and so should a player decide not to use a guide or look up something online, they definitely don't have to. And I do in fact know of people who prefer to play this way. The game does not try to be pretentious. For example, it doesn't have necessarily the most detailed or intuitive AI, but it also respects the player in that it knows that as gamers, we can pretty much figure out a lot of these things on our own. And that's also not to say that the game hasn't included numerous quality of life improvements over the previous Soulsborne games, such as the many sites of grace, which are essentially waypoints that you can teleport around to, and also checkpoints that revive you if you die. And even if you get someone stuck in a more difficult zone or encounter, there are plenty of side areas around the world that you can go to not only progress your character, but also pick up new equipment or new abilities and the like, which makes the game feel quite rewarding no matter where you go in the world, and also how much time you have to play. And next, in addition to delivering upon what From Software fans most wanted, they actually gave us even more, especially in the form of the Explorable open world. It is aesthetically inspiring with the cool and unique art direction that the game has. It is varied as well, and also incredibly large, yet super dense, with pretty much something to do and discover around every nook and cranny. And I'm sure there are a bunch of other things one can point out as to why Elden Ring has been so good and successful. But for now, let's actually examine what Blizzard can consider incorporating into Diablo 4 or any of their other Diablo games from Elden Ring. But first, I do want to acknowledge that Diablo does have some fundamental differences between it and games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring. First up, the Diablo series is a lot more focused on loot collection as opposed to just overcoming challenges and beating the game as in the Soulsborne games. And thus, the combat and balancing of these games is very much based around efficiency relative to how decked out in terms of gear a character actually is. And also related to the limitations of combat mechanics and balancing within Diablo is the fact that there has to exist distinct classes and class fantasies with abilities that ideally work very differently, but thus making it a bit more difficult to balance than, say, the more straightforward mechanics of a Soulsborne game. At least in terms of creating more nuanced and perhaps engaging combat, which having a primarily isometric view makes this very different to Elden Ring as well. And yet another major difference is because the game's endgame and replayability relies heavily upon the endless loot hunt, players are thus typically incentivized to return to the same dungeons and areas repeatedly with randomized maps, whereas in Elden Ring, players would typically only visit a dungeon or area once on a given playthrough, but still have a lot to do because of how large the game world is. But even with these differences outlined here, I still think that there are several things that Diablo and Diablo 4 specifically can't take away and incorporate from Elden Ring. First, I think Blizzard should design Diablo to let players play how they really want, instead of creating systems that incentivize too much min-maxing, which would actually limit build diversity. And this probably means not having an in-game like Diablo 3's, with greater risk being the main activity, where players just try to min-max for the absolute highest damage numbers, and there also being insane power creep. Next, and Blizzard seems to already be going in this direction, and that's having a large, immersive, and fun open world. And by this, I mean not only should the world feel dense and varied, but it should also feel adequately challenging and rewarding, with secret dungeons and items, for example, being an incentive to exploration, which means that these items should actually be useful in some way. And also, they can try to utilize the 3D-ness, so to speak, and altitude of the terrain to add another layer to the originally isometric gameplay. And my next point might actually be a little bit controversial, but I actually think that Blizzard shouldn't make the game too easy, and especially should not hold players' hands too much in game, but also ensure that there are enough resources outside the game, which there definitely will be with, YouTube and people making guides and such. I actually think that having just the right number of tooltips and say things like quest markers, but definitely not too much, adds to the mystique of the game and immersion, where players actually do have to think and figure things like where to go for quests out. Think early World of Warcraft and Elden Ring and even The Legend of Zelda. This sense of perpetual mystique, if you will, fuels people's imagination and keeps the game fresh and fun, and makes people think there's always something new to discover around the corner. So those are just some aspects I believe Diablo 4 can consider incorporating that could benefit the game if they haven't done so already. And now as for some more general, say, best practices for game development, and this is especially to address the current state of the gaming industry, where numerous practices nowadays seem to be geared towards maximizing profits as opposed to being in the best interests of gamers, and in my opinion, and in many cases, the best interests of the developers. And so first, I believe it's actually beneficial in the long run to focus foremost on how to make games actually fun and to serve the customer. And for this to work, it is important to be in touch with and know what players actually want instead of trying to dictate how they should be playing. And when a developer keeps this up long enough with enough games, like with From Software for the most part, and sort of ironically with the old Blizzard, then a player's sense of being trusted, validation, and trust can actually even help to elevate their perception of subsequent games, like with Diablo 3 actually sort of being carried by people's perception and great impressions of Diablo 2 and Diablo 1. At least when Diablo 3 first came out, and it's also, in my opinion, one of the reasons the game actually sold so well, despite not necessarily being the best game. Now, even though Blizzard's current reputation is somewhat tarnished, no pun intended, because, well, the tarnished is the main character in Elden Ring, but anyhow, I still believe that they can, in fact, despite all that has happened, redeem their reputation only if they actually put the players' fun and best interests first. And this doesn't just apply to Blizzard Entertainment, but pretty much all AAA game developers, in that I believe it's more important than ever to try to get in touch with your player base, try to understand what they want and what they find fun, and actually hire passionate and actual gamers to your companies. As someone who grew up playing video games in the 2000s, this was actually the norm for many game developers, and especially true for Blizzard during the time, right? Even though they didn't release games too frequently, everybody was actually fine with waiting for them because they knew that each game was going to be stellar and have that Blizzard polish and quality and uniqueness to them. And that has not been the case anymore for the better part of the last decade. Not only for Blizzard Entertainment, but for many other AAA developers as well, who have decided to commit to many consumer unfriendly practices, including overhyping and overpromising for games and then releasing vastly unfinished ones, and then just patching things as they go after release, essentially after raking in the cash from people who either pre-ordered or just bought the game off the start, and also doing things like gating significant amounts of content behind paywalls or making certain games even pay to win, and also just practices that are based around metrics and profit rather than what subjectively or as gamers themselves would actually make for other gamers to maximize fun. Nowadays, what many even mainstream titles seem to lack is that soul we felt from a lot of the games during the, say, 2000s. It is a sense and impression that a game was crafted with respect, passion, and love, and I do believe that Elden Ring is one of those rare cases in this modern age of gaming. And with that, do also let me know what you think in the comment section below. Is Elden Ring as good as people say? And if it is, what can game developers take away from it? Anyhow, thank you so much for watching. Remember to like the video if you liked it. And this has been Lon Measley signing off to go and play even more Elden Ring. Peace.